August 14th, 1969. Madison Square Garden. 3:47 p.m. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the empty arena, casting long shadows across thousands of vacant seats that would soon hold a sold-out crowd. But right now, in this moment of suspended anticipation, the garden felt like a cathedral of silence, broken only by the distant hum of amplifiers warming up and the occasional echo of footsteps on concrete. Marvin Gaye stood at the edge of the stage, staring out into the void of empty seats, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone stand. He had been scheduled for a brief sound check at 3:30, just a quick run-through before the evening's show, but the sound crew was running behind schedule. Equipment problems, they said. Technical difficulties that would delay everything by at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes of waiting. 20 minutes of standing here alone with his thoughts, with the weight of expectations pressing down on him like the thick August heat that had settled over Manhattan. 20 minutes to contemplate whether he still belonged on stages like this, whether his voice still carried the power it once had, whether the audience would hear his pain or just his performance. The past 18 months had been a slow-motion catastrophe. Tammi Terrell's illness had consumed his world, turning recording sessions into vigils and performances into exercises in barely controlled grief. Every time he stepped onto a stage, he felt her absence like a physical wound. The duets they would never sing again, the harmonies that existed now only in his memory, the way she used to look at him from across the microphone, her eyes full of understanding and shared sorrow. But the music industry waited for no one's grief. Motown expected him to continue, to produce, to perform, to be the romantic prince of soul that sold records and filled venues. Berry Gordy had been patient, understanding even, but there were limits to patience in a business that measured success in chart positions and album sales. Marvin knew he was walking a thin line between artistic expression and commercial irrelevance. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself, to find that place inside where the music lived, where his voice could reach beyond his own suffering and touch something universal. But all he found was static, interference, the sound of his own doubts echoing back at him. That's when he heard it. The guitar started softly, almost conversationally, a series of notes that seemed to emerge from the shadows of the stage like smoke. Not a song exactly, but not random noodling either. Something in between, exploratory and tentative, but with an underlying confidence that spoke of hands that knew their way around a fretboard. Marvin opened his eyes and turned toward the sound. There, at the far end of the stage, barely visible in the dim backstage lighting, was a figure bent over a Fender Stratocaster, lost in concentration. Even from this distance, even in the poor light, there was no mistaking that silhouette, that distinctive posture, that wild halo of hair. Jimi Hendrix. Marvin's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known Jimi was on the bill tonight, hadn't been told they would be sharing the stage. The promoters had kept the lineup details vague, talking about special guests and surprise performers. But Marvin had assumed it was the usual collection of Motown artists and established soul acts. Not this. Not the most innovative guitarist on the planet, the man who was reshaping what rock music could be, what electric instruments could express. For a moment, Marvin considered leaving, just walking away, finding the stage manager, explaining that there had been some mistake, that his sound check could wait until Jimi was finished. The last thing he needed was to be reminded of how far the musical world had moved beyond what he represented, how his own artistic struggles paled in comparison to the revolutionary sounds emerging from artists like Hendrix. But something in the guitar tone held him. There was a melancholy in it, a searching quality that reminded him more of gospel than rock, more of Sam Cooke than Cream. Jimi wasn't showing off, wasn't unleashing the kind of sonic assault that had made him famous. He was just exploring, working through something, the way musicians do when they think no one is listening. Marvin found himself moving closer, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. As he approached, he could see Jimi more clearly. The guitarist was completely absorbed in what he was playing, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. There was something vulnerable about his posture, something that suggested this wasn't performance, but private communion with his instrument. The melody Jimmy was working with started to resolve itself into something recognizable, though filtered through his distinctive harmonic sensibility. It took Marvin several bars to realize what he was hearing, a slowed-down, blues-inflected version of Ain't No Mountain High Enough, the song that had defined his partnership with Tammi, transformed into something entirely new, yet somehow more emotionally direct than the original. Marvin's heart began to race. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was Jimi Hendrix, the avatar of musical innovation, playing a song that represented everything Marvin felt he had lost, everything that belonged to a past he could never reclaim. But instead of mockery or appropriation, what Marvin heard was respect, even reverence. Jimmy was treating the melody like something sacred, exploring its emotional core rather than its commercial surface. Without consciously deciding to do so, Marvin began to hum along. Quietly at first, almost inaudibly, just letting his voice find the spaces between Jimmy's notes. The harmony came naturally, instinctively, the way it always had when he was truly connected to the music, rather than just going through the motions. Jimmy's eyes opened slowly, his playing never faltering, but Marvin could see the moment of recognition, the slight widening of his gaze as he realized he was no longer alone on the stage. For several seconds, they just looked at each other across the 20 feet of stage space that separated them, the guitar continuing to weave its spell while Marvin's voice grew slightly stronger, more confident. Then Jimmy smiled. Not the showman's smile that audiences saw, but something smaller, more genuine. A musician's smile, the kind that said, "Yes, this is what I was hoping for. This is why we're here." Marvin felt something unlock inside his chest, some knot of tension he had been carrying for months beginning to loosen. He took a step closer, then another, his humming gradually evolving into actual vocals, wordless at first, but carrying all the emotion he had been unable to express in interviews or conversations or even prayer. "Ain't no mountain high enough," he sang softly, but not the triumphant declaration of the original. Instead, it emerged as a question, a plea, an expression of doubt about whether love really could conquer the obstacles life placed in its path. Jimmy responded by shifting the chord progression slightly, adding subtle dissonance that reflected the uncertainty in Marvin's voice while still supporting it, creating a musical conversation that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to understand intuitively. They had never met formally, had never been introduced, or even been in the same room together before this moment. They came from different musical worlds, different artistic philosophies, different approaches to what popular music could and should be. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the sound they were creating together. The way Jimmy's guitar seemed to anticipate where Marvin's voice wanted to go. The way Marvin's vocals found spaces in Jimmy's harmonic architecture that neither of them had known existed. For 5 minutes that felt simultaneously like hours and seconds, they played together in the empty garden. Two of the most innovative artists of their generation, discovering common ground in a song about overcoming obstacles, about love persisting despite impossible odds. No one else was listening. No recording equipment captured it. There were no cameras, no witnesses except for the ghosts that inhabit all great venues and the afternoon light that continued to shift and fade as the New York sun moved across the sky. Marvin found himself thinking about Tammi, but for the first time in months, the thought didn't bring crushing sadness. Instead, he felt something like gratitude, as if she had somehow orchestrated this moment, bringing him together with another artist who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, but communication, connection, a way of touching something transcendent, even in the midst of personal suffering. The song began to wind down naturally, Jimmy's guitar growing softer and more contemplative, while Marvin's voice settled into a peaceful resolution that neither of them had forced or planned. When the last note faded, they stood in silence for several seconds, both seeming to understand that they had experienced something rare and unrepeatable. Finally, Jimmy spoke. His voice was quieter than Marvin had expected, more reflective. "That was beautiful, man. Really beautiful." Marvin nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. When he finally responded, his words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you. I needed that. More than you know." "Music's supposed to heal," Jimmy said, adjusting his guitar strap and looking out at the empty seats. "Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes I get so caught up in trying to push boundaries and challenge expectations that I forget music's also supposed to comfort, you know, supposed to help people feel less alone. You've never forgotten that, Marvin replied, surprising himself with his certainty. I can hear it in everything you play, even when you're being experimental, even when you're breaking rules, there's still heart in it. There's still someone reaching out, trying to connect. They talked for a few more minutes, quietly and without the performance anxiety that usually characterized meetings between major artists. Jimmy asked about Tammi, not in the intrusive way that journalists did, but with genuine concern for how Marvin was handling the loss. Marvin found himself sharing thoughts he hadn't been able to express to anyone else about how grief was changing his relationship with music, about his fears that his best creative days might be behind him. Jimmy listened without trying to offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened, the way musicians do when they recognize pain in another artist's voice. When Marvin finished talking, Jimmy was quiet for a long moment before responding. The pain doesn't go away, he said finally, but it changes form. It becomes part of what you have to offer, part of what makes your music different from everyone else's. The trick is learning to carry it without letting it carry you. Before either of them could say more, voices approached from backstage. The sound crew was returning, along with stage managers and venue personnel, ready to resume the technical preparations for the evening show. The private moment was ending, about to be replaced by the machinery of professional performance. Jimmy quickly unplugged his guitar and gathered his equipment. As he prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at Marvin. Maybe we could do that again sometime. Officially, I mean. Record something together. Marvin smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed in weeks. I'd like that. I'd really like that. But both of them knew, even as they said goodbye, that it probably wouldn't happen. The music industry didn't work that way. Their respective record labels had different priorities, different visions for their artists' careers. The moment they had shared belonged to them alone, unrepeatable and unprofitable, the kind of artistic communion that existed outside the commercial structures that governed their professional lives. As the garden filled with technicians and the afternoon dissolved into evening preparation, Marvin remained on stage for a few more minutes, processing what had happened. The brief collaboration with Jimmy had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that music, at its core, was about human connection, not chart positions or record sales or critical acclaim, but the simple act of one person reaching out to another through sound, through rhythm, through the vulnerable act of making organized noise and hoping someone else would understand. When his own soundcheck finally began, an hour later, Marvin felt different, more present, more connected to his own voice in the songs he had chosen to perform. The sound engineer commented on how much better he sounded compared to recent performances, how much more engaged he seemed with the material. That night's show was one of Marvin's best in months, not because he had experienced some miraculous healing or discovered profound new artistic insights, but because he had been reminded that he wasn't alone in his struggles, that other artists were also working through pain and doubt and the challenge of remaining authentic in an industry that prioritized profit over artistry. Jimmy's set that evening was equally powerful, though he never mentioned their afternoon encounter to the press or the audience. Both artists understood that some moments were meant to remain private, that not everything needed to be documented or marketed or turned into content. In the years that followed, as both men continued their separate artistic journeys, they would occasionally cross paths at industry events or find themselves on the same festival lineups. They would nod to each other, exchange pleasantries, but they never directly referenced that August afternoon at Madison Square Garden. It remained their secret, a shared memory of artistic communion that belonged to no one else. When Jimmy died in September 1970, just 13 months after their soundcheck encounter, Marvin felt the loss personally, as if he had lost not just a fellow musician, but a co-conspirator in the ongoing effort to keep music honest and emotionally authentic. He attended the memorial service quietly, saying nothing to reporters, but carrying with him the memory of 5 minutes when two very different artists had found common ground in the simple act of making music together. The collaboration that never became official, the recording that was never made, the friendship that existed only in potential. These absences became as meaningful to Marvin as many of the concrete achievements of his career. Sometimes the most important musical moments are the ones that can't be commodified or repeated, that exist only in the memories of the musicians who experienced them. Years later, when interviewers would ask Marvin about influences and collaborations, he would sometimes mention that afternoon, though always vaguely, without specifics. He would talk about the importance of musical communion, about how artists could support each other without competition or ego, about moments when the boundaries between different genres and styles dissolved in favor of pure emotional expression. But he never told the full story, never described the exact details of what he and Jimmy had shared. Some things he understood were too precious to be explained, too private to be performed. The sound check that became a prayer, the accident that felt like destiny, the 5 minutes that reminded two great artists why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. In the end, that might have been their greatest collaboration. The decision to keep something beautiful to themselves, to resist the industry's demand that every moment be monetized and every connection be exploited. In a world that increasingly treated artists as brands and music as product, they had managed to preserve a small space for mystery, for the kind of artistic intimacy that can't be captured or repeated. The empty garden that afternoon had been their church, their shared song a form of prayer. And like all sacred experiences, it was meant to be carried in the heart rather than displayed for public consumption. A reminder that the best music happens not when artists are trying to impress audiences, but when they're simply trying to reach each other across the spaces that separate all human beings, using the only language that sometimes feels adequate to the task of connection. The organized expression of the inexpressible, the sound of souls recognizing each other in the dark.